When looking at whether the New Deal was in fact successful, it becomes, as I said, very difficult to know sort of where the New Deal ends and where the ramp up to World War II, which is really going on towards the second half of the New Deal, really starting up in 1936 all the way through the official involvement in 1941. But if you look at FDR and you look at unemployment, it didn't go away entirely. Now, to expect that it would go away entirely is really hard to expect. Now, certainly during war, it does, but there's almost sort of a depression within the depression in 1937, and some people call it the Roosevelt recession. And one of the reasons is that Social Security, which I didn't really talk about, but it is taking money out of people's pockets and sort of putting it into a bucket that old people are going to get, and you sort of pay into the future. Well, again, you're going to not have money in people's pockets that they can put into the economy. And in addition, Roosevelt started having these real concerns like, wait a second, I'm really spending a ton. Let me try to get a little more conservative. So when you have him sort of decreasing government spending at the same time that you're taking away from people's individual spending, then you've got a problem. And at this point, he embraces this idea of Keynesian economics, or what we call deficit spending, where he sort of goes back in, like, listen, I am going to have the government spend a bunch of money to jumpstart the economy. Now, it's important to realize that it's the only time I'm really going to talk about economics, but it is helpful to know deficit spending, where you sort of spend into what you don't have with the hope that you can create the economy getting going so that you can help out overall. Now, of course, when we look back at the New Deal being effective or not, or somewhere in between, it's hard to say because of World War II, but that hasn't stopped people from doing an evaluation. And some people said, again, that this was all just basically a quasi-socialist enterprise, as I told you guys during lecture, calling him Rooseveltsky. There are some conservatives that said, you know what, all you did was bring in these sort of Jewish democratic elites, which, again, in a time of still anti-Semitism, was a major criticism. Business people said, you know what, like, you just were throwing spaghetti at the wall. You never really cared about us overall. You can look at the NRA and say, look what you forced us to do with these, minimum wages and maximum hours and maximum prices. At the same time, and we have to really consider this in terms of the legacy of the New Deal, this was the first time that the federal government really stepped in and became this, oversight regulating organization. Now, obviously, during the Progressive era, and this is sort of an extension in some ways, or revisiting the Progressive era. During the Progressive era, the whole idea was making the government, an instrument of social welfare. That seems rather minor compared to what the New Deal did in terms of its, tentacles in so many different aspects of, social and economic life. And again, people, some people really needed that, but other people, said, what are you talking about? You've just created a handout state. So as we talked about with seventh period, when they said, teach a man to fish, people weren't teaching anybody. They were just getting the fish. So people said there was a real sort of case of the gimmies. Now, again, you're going to have people that say, look, like, you should have been supporting business like people like Hoover did, but instead you're looking out for that little guy, the laborer and the farmer. What are they going to do for the economy? And then, of course, you've got this true sort of look what's happening in the Soviet Union. They've got a planned economy. Looks like you're doing that. You're calling too many shots about what the economy is doing. And they pointed to places like the TVA and creeping socialism, quote unquote. The bottom line is it failed to eliminate employment, or unemployment, I should say. So some people would say that it really failed to appropriately resolve the depression. But on the flip side, there are people who said, no, you're missing the point. The goal was relief, to make sure that people had jobs. And if you do look at that, with like the WPA and the CCC and the TVA, the NRA, they all were in some ways about job creation. And so if we're looking at relief and making sure that people have money, not just for the economy, but also for their confidence and morale, you can say that FDR did well on that. And there are people who said, look, when he came into office in 1933, it was the worst time. People were better off in the end. And people will argue what he did was avert an even worse problem. So if you kept Hoover in, maybe it would have gotten worse and worse. And then if you look at it sort of with historical context, when you move from one president to the other, like we saw in 1800, moving from the Federalist John Adams to the Democratic Republican Jefferson, people were concerned then with this quote unquote, revolution of 1800. Would you be able to transition without, bloodshed? And FDR was able to do that as well. Now, of course, it's not a political transition, but really an economic transition, calling in or ushering in an entirely new paradigm. And in the face of what's going on in Europe, not only in Spain, but in Italy and Germany, and to be able to say, there were tough economic times, but they didn't usher in a fascist leader. It's ironic that this Democrat, this sort of standard bearer for large government Democrat, is very Hamiltonian in this idea of big government, while at the same time being very Jeffersonian with his call about the forgotten man. And if you're going to look at it sort of writ large, he kept democracy, and people were better off. Now, he didn't eliminate unemployment. That's going to be something that World War II is ultimately going to do.